If you've been around New Hope or Westlake Lutheran any period of time, you don't need to be introduced to Arnold Reuter. A charter member of the congregation, has been, I don't know how many roles you've filled, but quite a few, probably all of them at one point, and has been our financial secretary for the entire time I've been here, for a short gap, I think, and then pretty much the 20 years before that as well, so almost the entire 40-some years of our life together. We're going through the 40th anniversary notes and looking at Pastor Bob's comments and all that. It was always Arnold this and Arnold that, and Arnold Reuter's signature, looking pretty much the same as it does today. So here's, Arnold and I talked the other day, and here's a part of Arnold's story, and I'm going to fill in a little bit of the gaps, and then if you have questions for him, you can ask him afterwards. He's agreed to take some questions. Do what you have to do. It was the advice given to me from my mother. Do what you have to do. The Reuter family lived in Detroit. They were Christian people, Lutherans, both sides. And that was the advice given to Arnold when he asked his mother about having to kill someone. She was the one in the family who was the disciplinarian. She was the one whose faith was emulated. Do what you have to do. The war was on. World War II. I graduated June 14th, 1944. The next day I turned 18. And so I registered for the draft. By Labor Day of that year, I was in the Army, sent to Camp Croft, Spartanburg, South Carolina. At the time, practically everybody trained as infantry with the intent to be sent to the Pacific Theater. In December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium happened, and they cut our basic training and they sent us home on leave for 5 days because the Army had other plans for us. I lived in Detroit, Michigan, the youngest of 6, 5 boys and 1 girl. I was raised in church, baptized, confirmed, communed in the family's church. So I came home on leave in December, had to report to New York 5 days later. December 1944, Detroit, Michigan. The snow came down that year like it is this year, he said. The taxi cab driver who was to pick me up couldn't drive up the side street, so I had to carry my duffel bag from all the way from the house to the main corner. When we arrived in New York, they loaded us on the Queen Mary. I was assigned to a stateroom where they would be normally a double bed, but the Queen Mary had been adapted to be a troop transport. There were 12 of us soldiers, each assigned to one room on bunks strategically lining the room. We left on the Queen Mary at night, unescorted. We were in the North Atlantic in January. I was sick the entire time. We'd put our duffel bags in the hall and they'd slide back and forth in the hallway as the heaving of the ship would happen. After 5 days, the Queen Mary docked in Glasgow. When we disembarked, we were loaded on a train, rode all day long until we arrived at Southampton, England. We transitioned to another ship, sailed overnight to Le Havre, France. We unloaded, got back on a train, and rode for 3 days down to Metz, France. We were in what they called during World War I a 40 and 8, a transport that carried 40 men and 8 horses, though we had no horses. We tried to find a spot to spread out, get your back against the wall to rest. You have to do what you have to do. They would stop the train to serve us a meal alongside the track. When we arrived in Metz, they put us in a replacement depot. We were assigned a room, but most of the rooms were filled with wounded infantry who were now awaiting reassignment. I had to sleep on the concrete floor that first night. The next morning, we assembled for revelry. They called out my name and told me to gather my belongings and report to the office. They loaded us on a vehicle, drove all day. By the end of the day, we were in Luxembourg. I had no idea where that was. That night, they took us to a Roman Catholic convent. There was nowhere to sleep, so I slept on a library table in the convent. Half the convent was used by the nuns, and the other half was used by U.S. soldiers. The next morning, they took me to the 3rd Army Headquarters, Rear Escalon, to whom I was assigned under General George Patton. They needed a typist, and because in high school I had taken typing and I could type 45 words a minute, I was called up and assigned to the Adjutant General's office to type reports on incidents of self-inflicted wounds. See, during the Battle of the Bulge, numerous soldiers were shooting themselves to avoid going into combat, and each incident had to be reported to see if they were subject to court-martial. One night while at the convent, I was in a deep sleep, and I was dreaming and thought I heard something like the sound of bombing. The next day, I found out that the Germans were trying to kill Patton by firing at his headquarters. He was in the forward headquarters on the other side of Luxembourg. He wasn't hurt, but several were, and his driver was killed. They were using a railroad gun firing 20 miles away. We ultimately moved into Germany, eventually progressed to Erlangen, Germany, and then to Frankfurt, then to Munich. Near Munich, in Bad Tolz, I'd seen Patton in church every Sunday. We had a Methodist chaplain, my first exposure to the Methodist faith. Patton and the 3rd Army had freed Buchenwald concentration camp. I was on assignment with the Judge Advocate's office. They had taken prisoner statements, and the translators needed a typist for the translations of the stories of the concentration camp victims. They were recording evidence of the brutality at Buchenwald. The wife of the head officer of Buchenwald had saved tattoos of victims, infamously making a lampshade from them. They experimented with shrinking heads. Unbelievable. After the war in Europe ended, I had the opportunity to fly to Berlin. It was the time of the Berlin airlift, when the only way you could get in or out of Berlin was by air. I went there to see my next oldest brother, who was in the 82nd Airborne, assigned to occupy 1/4 of Berlin. I hadn't seen him since November 1942. It was now 1945. He'd never come home. He had been sent to Africa and then to England and entered the European theater on D+30, 30 days after D-Day. Came into Holland on a glider. When the war in Europe ended, we all anticipated being sent to the Pacific to fight Japan. We were all infantry, and we knew what was happening island by island in the Pacific. After the bombs were dropped, everything changed. After the war, I had to wait until 1946 to be discharged. Another brother was in the Navy, was drafted in 43. He had 5 children. So after the war, he was discharged before my brother that was in the 82nd Airborne, who had gone into service in 42. Despite the fact that he'd been drafted so early, he had more points because he had more kids. Women didn't drive much in those days, but his wife, needing to drive the 5 kids, had to do it. Seems like a lot of people had to do what they had to do. After the war, I returned home for a few years. Before the war, there was a Japanese family living in a house across from ours. When I came back, they'd been relocated. A new family was living there. They had a daughter named Dorothy, still living at home. She'd take out the trash and we'd talk. I'd be washing my car, she'd wash her car. We talked. We married in May of 1952. We have 4 children, Kathy, Dave, Mark, and Brian, 8 grandchildren, 5 great-grandchildren, and he boasted 3 doctors. I see it as a miracle that I took typing in high school. God preparing me in advance for my life. When facing war or any difficulty, you just face it with the prayer that it will all work out. And that's how Arnold's prayed his whole life. Even now, praying at lunchtime during work at Valley Oaks, he'll be sitting in his car having lunch, reciting the Lord's Prayer, an ancient prayer. I asked Arnold about his values and his guiding principles, and as you can imagine, it wasn't as many words as I would have used, but he said simply, I believe in honesty. Indeed you do. In all those years as our financial secretary, our head usher, and all those myriad of other responsibilities, he's demonstrated that value, hasn't he? Honesty. I think there's probably few people, although some in this room would maybe equal, have invested themselves in the church in the way in which you have for so long as you have. Arnold's a charter member of Westlake New Hope Lutheran. This church would never be here today if it wasn't for Arnold, and we certainly wouldn't be the same without him. That's the part of the story that Arnold wanted to tell. That's, of course, there's a lot more to tell. It's a story told by a realist with an honest sense of what it takes to do what you have to do. Thank you, Arnold. You got any questions for Arnold? You want to come up, Arnold?
My next oldest brother was 4 years older than I was. And when he was in high school, he was taking up typing. So my parents bought a used typewriter. And from him typing, he taught me to type. And then when I got to high school, I took typing and ultimately could type 45 words a minute.
Good to have a brother.
Yeah.
Are you talking about like a concentration camp?
Yes. During the Battle of the Bulge, some of the soldiers were actually shooting themselves in the foot to avoid combat. And so what would happen is they would investigate each case to determine whether they were going to court-martial the soldier or not. And if they were going to court-martial, it would go to the judge advocate. Or if it wasn't subject to court-martial, they would, just discipline them with something.
So you were typing off of a written report already? Somebody had written something down?
Yeah, in the Army what they do is they type a report and then you keep adding to it with amendments. And so it gets to be a continuous history of the case. Well, I went to the Bridge Academy and took some instruction.
You never played bridge back in Michigan?
No. Back in Michigan, the game was pinochle. We used to have family gatherings. We'd play 8-handed pinochle. And it wasn't until just a few years ago that I decided to learn how to play bridge, and so I went to the Bridge Academy and took instructions. And that's where I met, she moved to Arizona, Ann. She was played at the Bridge Academy, and we would play against each other occasionally.
Did you ever see any action?
No.
Oh, you told me one story.
Well, I didn't see any action, but
Yeah, this typewriter. Tell the typewriter running with the typewriter. What happened? Why
No.
did you have to run with your typewriter?
the nearest I came to action was Patton had a history of the Third Army in books, and he had them encased in wooden cases that were about the size of the top of this table here, and they were classified top secret. And when we moved from Frankfurt to Bad Tolz, Germany, they put them on a truck, and the weight of the truck was so heavy that when we're in a convoy, if we're going up a hill, we would end up being way behind the convoy. But when it came to go downhill, we had such a load. And the drivers were in the quartermaster corps, and most of the drivers had more bad time in the Army than they had good time. And the particular driver that I had, well, what they did is also had me carry a carbine because it was classified top secret. We had a load, and so this driver I had, he would fall behind, and then when we go downhill, he would pass everybody up and go ahead. And we came to a place where at the bottom of the hill, the bridge was bombed out. And so what he would do is when we were going downhill, he'd put the truck in neutral. He stalled the truck, and so he's trying to kick it back into gear, and he's pounding on the gear shift, trying to get it into gear. And I'm seeing this ravine coming up, and all of a sudden he got it into gear and finally, was able to control the truck. And at the bottom of the hill, it was cut into the side of the mountain.
Arnold, there's always this talk about Patton and Eisenhower didn't get along much.
Yeah.
Is you being part of the Third Army, did you, what did the average infantryman feel about that conflict? Did you see that? Was that something that you
No.
got any feeling about?
Patton, when we were in Bad Tolz, Germany, we had church we took over a German SS concern. We had an auditorium. They had electric shades on the windows. And every Sunday that he was around, he was in the front row of that church. And that's when I got to see Patton without his helmet on, because most pictures of him, he had a shiny helmet on, but he was a bald and had a glowing bald head. And, he had a dog that, if you ever saw the picture of Patton, the dog that they had in the picture was an exact duplicate of his bulldog. And one day, I was watching him go to lunch. And so he was coming out, and then his staff would fall behind, and coming up in the rear was a guy leading the dog. And so he takes the dog, and the dog got a seat at the table with them to eat lunch. And
No one said anything.
no. The dog's name was Sir William something or other, but he used to call him Willie. And His other name for him was Son of
Another question. You've been around through all of the history of Westlake and New Hope.
yeah.
When you think of that, what memories stand out in your mind of things that have really enriched your life being part of the church?
Yeah.
There's a lot of history.
Yeah. I wanted to tell you that after after I retired, I took a vacation bus trip to around Europe, and the bus driver, I got him to go to Luxembourg, and Patton is buried in the cemetery in Luxembourg, and he is located, and then all the other graves are in a semicircle from his grave. And some of you know John Crossan, who used to belong to the church. I was talking with John one time, and I found out that he was in the MPs, and he served on Patton's funeral deal. He helped bury Patton. Pardon?
I know that you and your wife, Dot, did not share the same Christian faith, but you had such a wonderful, fruitful life together. I wonder how you worked that out. Did what you had to do? I mean, how did you come to? I'm thinking, and you got married in 1952. I mean, I would think that families maybe weren't thrilled about a mixed marriage like that.
No. If my mother had been alive when I got married, I think she would have been disturbed. But my father wasn't at all. And I took instructions, before I was married. And I chose not to leave the Lutheran church. I was raised a Lutheran, and I was going to stay a Lutheran by God. And I had the 4 children were baptized Catholic, raised Catholic, and one of them is now a Lutheran.
He's the one with the sense of humor.
But my wife, raised Catholic. She went to church every Sunday, and I think that got me to go to church every Sunday.
So you just decided to go to a different church.
Yeah. Natalie Larkin, the first church that I went to after we were married, used a school 5 doors away. And Natalie Larkin's father was the founding pastor of that.
And this is in Detroit?
Yeah, in the suburb of Detroit. Yeah.
What brought you to California?
Well, I worked for Burroughs for 39 years, and Burroughs owned the property where the Four Seasons Hotel is.
Right.
We had 30 acres there, and we built a 400,000 square foot factory there. At that time, they built the disc file and tape units. Disc file at that time was 10 megabytes, and it had 4 30-inch brass discs Well, since '99.
How did you get connected with Bob Lawson in the church? How did you?
Well, I came out here one time on a trip for Burroughs, and I went to Holy Trinity, and he was preaching at Holy Trinity, and I got exposed to him and attracted to him. So when I went to Holy Trinity for a while, and then when they announced that they were starting Westlake Lutheran, I told them I was going to leave and go with Bob Lawson.
How many people were involved in that early?
Hmm.
How many people were involved in that early group that was with Bob?
I don't know. I remember the first service we had was in one of the homeowners association, and what's her name played the piano, Sandy Brown, and I can remember going to the first service and sitting there and looking out the window, and there's a swimming pool, and some of the residents were swimming while he was preaching.
Great for baptism.
Yeah. And then we eventually moved over in with the Methodists. And at one time we had 3 faiths. We had the Jewish and the Methodists and the Lutherans. You remember those?